I've taught philosophy to university students for over 20 years. In trying to explain philosophy to other people, I have learned more about philosophy than when I was a student. Always, I have sought to show students how philosophy relates to their everyday lives. I present to my students how the ideas of important philosophers help us address the issues we face, how approaching the world with a philosophical mindset helps them understand and handle life's problems, big and small. For years, I have been honing my Introduction to Philosophy course to better and better assist the students to learn philosophy. I should point out that most of my students are non-majors. They have no prior experience with philosophy. They have no real understanding of what philosophy is, what philosophers do, and quite frankly, don't really have much interest in philosophy because, well, they have no idea what it is and have had no exposure to it, and what exposure they may have had was actually done rather poorly to them. A major shortcoming of most philosophy textbooks that are out there and that are produced by major corporate publishing houses is how little attention the textbooks give to recent philosophy. And by recent philosophy, I mean pretty much anything within the last 50 to 100 years. These textbooks give students the false impression that philosophy was a pursuit of the past, now obsolete. Frustrated by that and other deficiencies of the available introduction textbooks, the exorbitant price tags included in that big time, I spent a few years writing my own, called How We Are and How We Got Here. That book was published last year, and in that book I felt it very important to present to my students a textbook that gives a chronology of Western philosophy's development that includes coverage of how the history has manifested in the most recent decades. I'm one of the very few textbooks out there, if not the only textbook out there, that gives real service to philosophy in the last few decades and philosophy going on now. A challenge I have faced all of my career of teaching philosophy is what to cover in a 14-week term. It seems that always I have at least 15 years of material to cover, but only 14 weeks in which to do it. In the chronology of Western philosophy, and yes, we cover non-Western philosophy in another course, I've always started the term with a week on Plato. Seems natural. And the first chapter in my textbook covers Plato, what seems very natural. Begin at the beginning. I've always assumed Plato is essential, and have cut out other topics later in the history of philosophy to fit within time constraints. This term, though, I have begun to question that assumption that Plato is an absolutely essential beginning. Plato has always elicited the same general responses from students. They see Plato's theory of forms as dubious, and his approach to knowledge as disconnected from reality. After week one of the course, of every course, many of the students have had confirmed their suspicion, widely held in society, that philosophy is silly and meaningless to their lives. It takes me weeks, literally weeks, to win back some students into believing in philosophy as something not a waste of their time. Our current society's fixation on the hegemony of science and technology has much to do with the students' prejudicial stance against Plato's type of philosophical approach. When in week two the students learn about Aristotle, they find his approach more familiar and thus more reasonable and dismiss Plato as completely irrelevant, maybe even an idiot. Other than a lingering impression that philosophy is a little silly, Plato's ideas, no matter how formative, have little effect on them. I've encountered this issue for years, my entire career. No matter how much explanatory material I give students to convince them of Plato's value, they just don't appreciate it, don't get it, and dismiss Plato. Recently, this term, while I was reading my students' essays on the subjects of German idealism and 19th century social philosophy, several comments two students made in their essays gave me the radical and almost heretical thought of starting the term not with Plato, but with Aristotle or even medieval philosophy. This would mean students' initial exposure in the course is an approach more familiar to them, reducing their initial resistance to philosophy. And remember, these are non-majors taking this course as a forced distribution requirement. They didn't volunteer to do this much. Removing Plato leaves more time for other important philosophers later in history. I can pick up on Plato's influence on later philosophers later in the term, so it would not mean shutting him out entirely. It would keep the chronological order of teaching that is so crucial to understanding philosophy, while perhaps eliminating an obstacle to students' learning. An Intro to Philosophy course is, after all, about helping students learn about the importance of philosophy. And if what we do is turn them off to philosophy, that defeats the purpose. No doubt, some people will take umbrage at the suggestion of decreasing coverage of Plato. As important as Plato is, there is inordinate weight placed on ancient Greek philosophy, in both intro courses and in philosophy textbooks. Someone recently shared with me an Intro to Philosophy syllabus in which the professor spent 5 of the 14 weeks of the course on the ancient Greeks, leaving nothing said about philosophy after the year 1900. I find that a grave disservice to students. The Enlightenment era infatuation with the Greeks is not something we need to maintain to the detriment of all that has transpired since. I have reached out to some colleagues and asked them what they think of my idea. These are professors of philosophy at other universities. And the responses I received were mostly unsurprising. There were several people that said, "Oh, you can't give up on Plato. The dialogues are so interesting. Plato's Apology, Crito, so interesting stuff. And you teach them as literature and get students excited." And if these professors find those aspects of Plato exciting, well, more power to them. And I'm sure there are some students that do find the Platonic dialogues interesting, maybe even exciting. But I'm not teaching to just those people. I'm teaching to a wide variety of students, again, most of them non-majors who aren't already prone to loving philosophy. And I think Plato's dialogues belong more in an advanced course for philosophy majors. Another professor says something that really speaks to the point that I've been thinking about. He said that we need to get beyond the, quote, undergraduate hazing rituals that professors make us all do, and forcing them to read these obscure ancient texts. As well, he said, as getting rid of the weird fetishization of the ancients and the parsing of their largely irrelevant or superseded thinking as if our students need to be a bunch of disconnected and hived off scholastic monks. I think this is true. The scholastics, the late medieval philosophers like Thomas Aquinas and the Thomist philosophers coming after him, were fixated with Aristotle because that's pretty much all they had. The real fetishization of the ancients occurred after that in the Enlightenment, where a large group of people, of intellectuals of great stature, no doubt, of great ability, no doubt, did indeed fetishize the ancients as a way of pushing against the hegemony of the Christian church and Christian theology. And in particular, the love of Plato was a reaction to the dominance of Thomist Aristotelian scholastic philosophy. In the 1500s and 1600s, and even into the 1700s, the love of Plato, the love of the Socratic dialogues, was seen as a pendulum swing away from the dry logic chopping of the scholastics, the Aristotelians. These are all good and wonderful historical facts that if you are a philosophy major, you do need to understand and incorporate into your view of the history of Western philosophy. However, my job is not to hone philosophy majors. Not that I am against philosophy majors, obviously, and not that I don't encounter them. But most of my students, again, are non-majors. And indeed, my job here as a podcaster, a writer, a video maker on the web and insertphilosophyhere.com is not to speak to the ivory tower and let's create more carbon copy fetishizers in the ivory tower. My job is to reach beyond the ivory tower to people who have no real understanding or knowledge of philosophy, who need to have their resistance to philosophy overcome. I have nothing against Plato's Apology or Crito or Euthyphro, but there are dozens of important philosophical texts that I wouldn't remove to keep those Platonic dialogues in an Intro to Philosophy course. Philosophers who deal with the issues we face today are important, and giving students the philosophical tools to help them think about those issues is very important. I would rather a student who has never taken philosophy, who takes my course, comes away from my course with the attitude and knowledge that philosophy is something that pertains to their lives, pertains to our society, that is attempting to solve the problems that we face today. I would much rather have them have those impressions than the impression that philosophy was something that happened centuries ago, with people arguing about very obscure, arcane ideas. You can say, well, Plato, blah, 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 blah. Yes, Plato does connect in certain ways, but that's a more advanced topic. And I like this little niche that I've carved out in my career. Yes, I do write very serious books for very serious advanced philosophers. But I also love talking to people who have no knowledge of philosophy, who are encountering it for the very first time in their lives. That's a wonderful thing. I am introducing people to the joys of philosophy. The answer ultimately at the universities is to have students take a full year of philosophy, not just one 14-week term, but a full 28 weeks of experience with great ideas from multiple cultures, not just Western philosophy, and multiple time periods, not just the ancient Greeks and the Enlightenment philosophers. And that more holistic approach to philosophy would help students immensely, regardless of their major, to instill within students the knowledge and understanding of how philosophy has always been a part of our lives, always been a part of society, has shaped our society and our culture. Yes, let's give students a full year of introduction to philosophy, cover so much more material, so much more valuable ideas. Not many university administrators would go for that, though. In any event, over the summer, I will continue to mull over this heretical idea, and as someone already said, you've probably already made up your mind, and that's probably true. And some people are even pushing me to go further. Don't even introduce your students to Aristotle. One person said, start with Hobbes. I'm like, well, no, I have to start with Descartes before him. I got to start with Bacon before him, and then it gets into the where do you begin? But I'll think about it, because the important thing is to teach philosophy, not just as a love of wisdom, but to teach philosophy as a way to approach the universe and reality itself and improve our daily lives.